Welcome back. We're going to talk in our state and church, politics in church. We're going to talk about theonomy, and then we'll talk about in our next lecture, we'll talk about the two kingdoms view. Okay, theonomy is a term that means that God's moral law, as revealed in Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament civil laws, so you guys know, oftentimes the Reformed will break up the Old Testament law into three parts: moral, civil, ceremonial. Moral law basically is like the second half of the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and mother. That's a moral obligation that you have, but it has no civil code enforcing it. You got to do it, but there's no threat of the sword, or there's no political force enforcing it. That's the moral law. Civil law are moral ideals that have political force behind them. What's the punishment of murder? Right? You think about how that works. There's murder. Don't murder. That's a moral code. That's a moral law. Getting 30 years punishment for committing moral. Sorry guys, back it up. There's the moral law. Don't commit murder. That's a moral sixth commandment. It's free floating. It's an obligation God has put on all humans. It becomes civil when we add a punishment to it. A punishment that will be enforced on the breaking of that moral commandment. So, if we say death penalty for murder, what has happened? That moral law has now turned into a civil law, because there's some civil enforcement behind it. And then there's the ceremonial law that has to do with the worship of Yahweh. So they're saying that civil law should be enforced. Israel's civil law should be enforced. Theonomists argue that Christ's lordship extends to all spheres of life, including politics, and that the civil magistrate should enforce biblical moral principles. Right? You take the moral principle and make it a civil by adding punishments or rewards. They maintain that the Mosaic law, unless explicitly abrogated in the New Testament, remains binding for modern societies. This view is often, not exclusively, but often associated with post-mill eschatology, emphasizing the gradual Christianization of nations before Christ. So if you guys know what post-mill is, it's the belief that we are post the millennial reign of Christ, or we can say it like this: we are in the millennial reign of Christ, and that millennial reign is being extended throughout all nations. So you think back to that Acts passage, right? When are you going to establish the kingdom of Israel? The Theonomist is saying he is doing that right now. He's spreading that right now. Connected with which view? The Calvinist view, clearly, right? Of the four views from Niebuhr. So they're saying, you read civil law, the punishment for death in the civil code of Deuteronomy is the death penalty. We should enforce that today. Now, there is a form of theonomy, which most theonomists are, what's called general equity theonomy. The term comes from the Westminster Confession. And it simply means, the term comes from with general equity. That is, you take the civil code, you take out the equity of it, or the principle, or whatever you want to say, however it's thinking, and you take that equity and you kind of contextualize it for the modern period. Right. Can I take a code that has to do with the accident, an accident with the axe head, and apply it to manslaughter with the car? Or I can say, can I take the law that says I need to fence my roof and apply that and make it that I have to fence my pool because of the threat? Does that make sense? That's called general equity theonomists, which most theonomists are. Okay. The church has a prophetic role in calling the state to uphold divine judgment. Think about prophet and king from the Old Testament. The church operates like Samuel operates with Saul. His job is to call him to do what's right. Secular laws should conform to biblical moral standards. There's a little distinction between sacred and secular. All of life is under God's direct rule. And then the most famous theonomists, Rushdoony, Gary North, Greg Bonson, a lot of people. Those are just kind of like the real names that are associated with it. So you can ask yourself, well, what about that Romans 13 passage where it says the secular authorities should be obeyed above you? What does the theonomists say to that? Well, the theonomists, let's go back to that. Let's see if we can find it. The theonomists say, because it says for good, the assumption is the government is doing what's right in God's eyes. Right? They're going to come to this text and say, well, for rulers are not a terror for good conduct, but the bad. If they're not a terror for good conduct and but for bad, that means what? They're upholding the moral code of the scriptures. They're doing what's right in God's eyes, right? So they're going to come and say, well, this text should tell us that we should be enforcing this. Civil magistrate or secular political powers should be enforcing what's right in the eyes of God. Or this wouldn't work. That's what the theonomist is going to say. All right, until next time.